It was the morning of June 6, 1944. The sun was hidden behind a thick veil of gray clouds casting a dull light over the coast of Normandy. The sound of artillery fire echoed across the fields and the crashing waves below. But to Private James Walker, it felt like the world was closing in. He adjusted the strap of his rifle, feeling the weight of the weapon more than usual. The air smelled of salt and sweat, and the dampness of the earth seemed to seep into his bones. He looked around, trying to steady his nerves. He wasn't the only one feeling the dread. His comrades were all visibly tense, each man lost in his own thoughts as they prepared for the landing. The German forces had entrenched themselves in the hills above, and the Allied forces were coming to reclaim the land. The D-Day invasion was a decisive moment in the war, but for James, it was just another battle in the long line of struggles that had turned the world into a battlefield. "Stay sharp, Walker," Sergeant Carter called, clapping James on the back as they moved forward. James gave a tight smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. He wasn't a man of many words, and words didn't seem to mean much here anyway. It was the sound of the shells, the whistle of bullets, the cries of soldiers that would define this day. The landing was brutal, more so than anyone had imagined. The beach was soaked in blood, the air thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and burning wreckage. James felt his heart racing as he fought to stay grounded, moving with his squad toward the inland forest. They had to push the Germans back, but the enemy was ready. The trees ahead seemed to close in, a dark and impenetrable barrier hiding what was to come. James glanced back at his comrades. There was Private Lawrence, always the joker, trying to lighten the mood with a forced laugh. Then there was Corporal Miller, his face tight with focus, eyes scanning every movement in the distance, and Sergeant Carter, a no-nonsense leader, moving with the assuredness of a man who had seen it all. "We hold the line here, no matter what," Carter barked, his voice barely audible over the chaos around them. James nodded, his thoughts momentarily drifting back home. He hadn't written to his mother in weeks, and the thought of her sitting by the kitchen table waiting for news made his chest tighten. Would she ever know what happened to him? Then, as if the earth itself had swallowed the sound of everything else, the silence came. It was sudden. It was suffocating. A shell exploded nearby, and everything seemed to freeze in that split second. The world tilted on its axis. Screams echoed, but they were distant, like they were coming from someone else's nightmare. James's heart raced in his chest as his body was thrown forward by the force of the blast. He hit the ground hard, his rifle flying out of his grasp. He could hear voices. He could see flashes of movement. But something wasn't right. The world around him seemed to blur, spinning in a strange dance of lights and shadows. When he tried to move, his legs didn't respond. His hands, bloody and trembling, couldn't grip anything. His chest tightened as if something deep inside him was shutting down. The last thing he saw was a figure, Sergeant Carter, rushing toward him, but the light in the sky dimmed and his vision faded into darkness. When James regained consciousness, the world had shifted. His body felt stiff and numb, like it no longer belonged to him. The chaos of battle was gone, replaced by an eerie silence. He tried to call out, but his voice was weak. The sounds of the forest, the crackling of leaves, the distant calls of birds replaced the sounds of war. He turned his head slowly, trying to assess his surroundings. The others were gone. James lay there for hours, unable to move, as the weight of what had happened began to sink in. There had been no sign of the others after the explosion. The men he'd fought alongside, the comrades he had relied on, had disappeared without a trace. There was no sign of the German forces either, just the haunting quiet of the forest. He didn't know how long he lay there, but as the light began to fade, he knew he had to get up. He couldn't stay here. He had to find his men. He had to find a way back to them, but there was nothing. No tracks. No sign of life. James stumbled to his feet, his legs barely able to support him. He moved through the forest, disoriented and weak, his thoughts clouded with confusion and fear. As night fell, he knew he couldn't find his comrades. The search for them had to wait until morning, but morning never came for James Walker. Days turned into weeks, and James Walker's name was added to the growing list of missing soldiers from the D-Day invasion. His family back in Texas received a brief letter from the Army, missing in action, presumed dead. The uncertainty tore through them. His mother, Ellen Walker, clung to the hope that her son would return, but as time passed, she began to understand that she might never see him again. There were no answers. Only silence. It was a cold, overcast morning in 1975 when Sergeant Mark Connors sat at his cluttered desk, staring at the faded photograph in front of him. It was a picture of his old unit taken just before the D-Day invasion. He could still remember the faces, the names, the camaraderie they'd shared in the chaos of war. But one face was missing from this picture: Private James Walker. The disappearance of Walker had always haunted Connors. Of the many soldiers he had served with, Walker's absence had never been explained. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, his body was never found. No trace, no sign. The military had eventually declared him missing in action, presumed dead. But Connors could never shake the feeling that something didn't add up. There had been too many questions left unanswered. For years, Connors had buried the memories. He had moved on, returned to civilian life, married, and had children. But every now and then, Walker's name would slip into his thoughts, haunting him in the quiet moments of the night. Then, in 1975, Connors found himself in an old military warehouse, sifting through boxes of forgotten records. His job had recently shifted to managing historical archives, and while it was far from the adrenaline of combat, it had its own kind of unease. Something about it felt wrong. It was as though the past was calling to him. That's when he stumbled upon a file he wasn't supposed to see. Walker, James. The label on the folder had been buried beneath piles of other unimportant paperwork, yet it stood out to Connors as if it had been waiting for him all along. He opened the folder slowly, as if afraid to disturb the fragile remnants of the past. Inside was a series of documents, official military reports, letters, and, strangely, a hand-drawn map. The map was crude, its edges worn, but it depicted a section of the forest near where Walker had vanished. Connors ran his fingers along the map, tracing the path that led deep into the forest. He had never seen it before. It didn't match any records of the battle or the searches that had been conducted in the aftermath. The military had always assumed Walker's disappearance was simply a casualty of war, a tragic but ultimately unsolvable mystery. But this map, it was a clue, a possible lead. His heart raced as he scanned the rest of the documents. Among them was a journal written in Walker's own hand. Connors could barely believe his eyes. It was dated from the days following the invasion. Walker had kept a record of his experiences, of what had happened after he was separated from the unit. The journal painted a picture of fear, uncertainty, and, most chilling of all, a reference to something else, something the Army had never acknowledged. Walker had written about a hidden bunker in the forest. He described it as a place of refuge for soldiers, but it wasn't like any of the Army's standard bunkers. There were strange symbols carved into the walls, markings that didn't make sense. Walker had written of whispers in the night, of shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Connors could hardly believe what he was reading. Had Walker discovered something in the forest? Something the Army had covered up? Or had he been subjected to a wartime experiment gone wrong? Connors' mind raced with questions. It was clear now. Walker had survived longer than anyone had realized. But what happened to him after that? Where had he gone? And why had the military never followed up on this lead? Determined to get answers, Connors reached out to the few surviving members of Walker's unit. The men had scattered after the war, their lives having taken them in different directions. Some had built families, others had faded into obscurity, but Connors knew they had to know something, anything, that could help explain Walker's disappearance. The first man he contacted was Corporal Miller, one of the few soldiers who had been with Walker during the final push into the forest. Miller was reluctant to speak at first, his voice guarded, his memories clouded by the years. "We weren't supposed to go into those woods, Connors," Miller finally said, his voice low. "But we did. We were following orders, but something wasn't right. There were things in those woods, things we couldn't explain. Some of the guys started talking about ghosts, but I think it was just the stress, the war." Connors leaned forward, his interest piqued. "What do you mean by things in the woods?" "I can't say for sure. We heard voices, whispers really. Some of the men thought they were hearing things. Others thought there were more soldiers hiding. But we never found any. Then Walker. He just disappeared. One minute he was there and the next he was gone. And nobody had a clue what happened to him." Connors felt a chill run down his spine. "Did you see the bunker?" he asked. Miller was silent for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was shaky. "The bunker? No, we heard about it, though. Some of the guys said they saw it, but they were too scared to go near it. They said it wasn't just a military bunker. It was something else. And Walker? I think he went there, but why? What was he looking for?" Connors felt a sudden weight in his chest. He had never considered that Walker might have been searching for something more than just survival. Had he stumbled upon something the military had kept hidden? And if so, was it the reason why he'd vanished? Determined to find answers, Connors made the decision. He would return to Normandy. He would search the woods himself. The clues were here, scattered across the pages of forgotten documents and the fading memories of men who had lived through the horrors of war. It was time to follow the map, to uncover the truth that had been buried for over 3 decades. The forest was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. Connors stood at the edge of it, a small group of veterans and historians gathered behind him. The years had weathered them, their faces lined with time, but the same determination that had fueled them during the war now burned in their eyes. This wasn't just a search for answers. It was a quest for redemption, for the closure they had never received. It had been over 10 years since Connors had first uncovered the map, and the urgency in his heart had only grown. Each year had chipped away at his resolve, but now, with the veterans returning to the place where they had once fought, the time for answers had come. "We need to start here," Connors said, pointing to the map. The markings on the page indicated a small hill deep within the forest, a place that had been overlooked by countless search parties after the war. It seemed unlikely that anything of significance remained, but the journal Walker had left behind spoke of the place with a sense of certainty that could not be ignored. The team moved forward, cutting through the underbrush, their boots crunching against the thick layers of fallen leaves. Every step felt like they were walking through the past, retracing the footsteps of the soldiers who had once fought here, unaware that their history would one day be revisited like this. Connors led the way, his heart pounding in his chest. The air felt heavier here, as though the forest itself had secrets it was unwilling to share. Connors glanced back at the veterans. Corporal Miller was silent, his face pale. The other men were equally quiet, as if the weight of the moment was too much to bear. After hours of searching, they reached the hill. The dense trees parted for a moment, revealing a small clearing. Connors felt a sudden, sharp pull in his chest. The spot was eerily familiar. Something about it felt like the place Walker had written about in his journal. It wasn't just any patch of land. There was something unsettlingly sacred about it, as though it had been untouched for decades. "Start digging here," Connors instructed, his voice steady despite the tension running through his veins. The men gathered their tools and began to work, but the task was not easy. The earth was thick with roots and stones, resistant to their efforts. The ground had never been disturbed, and Connors couldn't shake the feeling that they were unearthing something far more than just dirt and debris. It was nearly dusk when the first shovel clinked against something solid. One of the historians, a quiet man named Richard Blake, stopped digging and knelt down. "I think we found something," he said, his voice carrying a mix of awe and disbelief. Connors hurried over, his heart racing. They cleared away the soil with trembling hands, revealing the edge of a rusted metal door, half buried in the earth. It was an old military-grade bunker door, the kind used during the war, but this one had been hidden, abandoned, perhaps even forgotten by those who had once used it. "Is this it?" Blake whispered, his voice barely audible. Connors nodded, his face grim. "It's what we've been looking for." The team worked together, prying open the door with all their strength. It creaked and groaned as they lifted it, revealing the darkness below. The smell of stale air and mold rose from the depths, and the temperature dropped immediately. Connors felt a chill crawl up his spine. With flashlights in hand, they descended into the bunker. The narrow staircase was slippery with age, and the walls were coated in a layer of mildew. As they reached the bottom, they found themselves in a small room the size of a standard cellar. But it wasn't the size that caught Connors' attention. It was the contents. Scattered across the room were several personal belongings, papers, photographs, and clothing, all of it untouched by time. And in the center of the room, resting on an old wooden table, was a small leather journal. The cover was faded, but the pages inside were still intact, held together by a fraying string. Connors moved quickly, his hand shaking as he reached for the journal. As he opened it, his heart sank. It was Walker's handwriting, his unmistakable scrawl. The first page read, "I don't know how long I've been here." The others have gone silent, their faces pale, and I can see fear in their eyes. They talk in whispers. "We found something we should never have seen." Connors read further, his eyes scanning the pages. Walker had written about his time after the explosion, about how he had stumbled upon this bunker and taken refuge there, hiding from both the enemy and his own comrades. But it was the next entry that sent a shiver down his spine. There are markings on the walls, symbols. I don't know what they mean, but they seem to call to me. I'm not alone here. There are others watching. They won't let me leave. They never let me leave. Connors felt his stomach twist. The words seemed more like the ravings of a man losing his mind, but then, beneath the frantic writing, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A drawing. A crude sketch of the very bunker they were standing in. And beside it, a strange symbol, unlike anything Connors had ever seen before. Connors. Miller's voice broke through the silence. Connors looked up, finding Miller standing in the doorway, his face pale. "There's something else in here." Connors followed Miller's gaze to the far corner of the room where a metal chest sat against the wall. The chest was locked, but there was something about it, something that made Connors's heart race. He approached it slowly, his hand trembling as he reached for the lock. The moment he touched it, a chill ran down his spine. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed to echo throughout the room. Inside the chest were more papers, military documents, maps, and photographs, but it was one photograph that caught Connor's attention. It was a photograph of a group of soldiers, but in the background, barely visible, was a figure that could only be James Walker. But something was different about him. His eyes were hollow, his expression vacant. He was standing in the doorway of the bunker, staring at the camera with a look that spoke of deep, unfathomable terror. Connors held the photograph in his hand, his mind racing. James Walker had survived longer than anyone had known. But what had happened to him after that? What had driven him to this place of darkness and isolation? As Connors stared at the photograph, the words from Walker's journal echoed in his mind. "They never let me leave."